In this video we will explore the Russian Revolution of 1917. If you enjoy these videos, please let me know about any events throughout history you would like to see. Now sit back, relax and enjoy. The last day of February, 1917, came in the way most days had come that winter. Quietly, coldly, without ceremony. Masha Sorokina woke before the light. She always did. Habit had carved the hour into her body like a groove worn into stone, so that even on Sundays, even in illness, her eyes opened in the darkness at the same moment, that particular moment when the night is at its most complete, just before it begins, almost imperceptibly, to release its hold. She lay still for a little while. She did that now. Pavel used to say she bounced out of bed like a sparrow, but that was before. Now she allowed herself these few quiet minutes, listening to the apartment settle around her, listening to the cold. The cold had a sound in Petrograd that winter. It was not quite wind. It was a deep, pressurized stillness, as though the air itself had thickened and was pressing gently against the window panes, testing them. The pipes in the wall ticked and groaned. Somewhere below, in the courtyard, a dog barked once and then went silent. She rose. The floor was stone cold through her wool stockings. She did not have enough wood for the bedroom stove, so she moved quickly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, Pavel's mother's shawl, dark blue with a pattern of small white flowers, worn thin at the edges but still warm, still hers. She pulled it tight and moved through the apartment in the dark, navigating by memory, by the shape of the silence. Down the narrow stairs. Through the door that always stuck at the bottom and required a firm, practiced push of the hip. Into the bakery. Here, at least, was warmth. The oven was the heart of the place. She had banked it the night before, and it breathed now in the darkness, a deep, amber glow pulsing behind the iron door, the air around it thick with the ghost of yesterday's bread. Masha pressed her hands against the iron and let the heat climb into her fingers, into her wrists, up into the ache of her arms. She closed her eyes. There you are, she thought. She always thought it. She was not sure if she was thinking it to the oven, or to the warmth, or to something else entirely. She tied on her apron and began. Flour first. The sacks were lighter than they should have been. This was the truth she had been living with since November, a truth that had grown more pressing each week. The flour was running low, the supply uncertain, the prices extraordinary. She measured carefully, the way you measure when you are not sure there will be more. She had learned this kind of measuring as a child, during the lean years, and she had hoped never to need it again. But the body remembers what the mind would prefer to forget. She worked the dough with her hands. There is something very old about this, the pressing of palms into dough, the turning and folding, the rhythmic push that sends you almost into a kind of waking sleep. Masha had been doing it since she was 7 years old, standing on a stool beside her mother in a village kitchen 300 kilometers south of here, and the motion had become so deeply part of her that she sometimes thought she could do it in her sleep. Perhaps she did. Perhaps she had been doing it in her sleep for months. Outside, the city was beginning to stir. She could hear it faintly at first, then more clearly as the hour progressed. The creak of carts on cobblestones. The cough of a neighbor somewhere above. The tram, distant, then near, then gone again. Petrograd was a vast machine, and every morning it turned itself over and started, and every morning Masha found something almost comforting in that, the persistence of ordinary things, the city going about its business despite everything. But that morning, she became aware of something else. A sound beneath the sounds. Not loud. Not alarming, exactly. More like a change in pressure. The way the air feels before a storm arrives, when the birds go quiet and the light takes on a particular quality, flat and yellow, and your body knows before your mind does that something is coming. She kept working the dough. The first customers came at 7. Old Dmitri Pavlovich, who lived across the courtyard and had been buying his bread from them since before Masha was married. He came in stamping snow from his boots, his beard white with frost, his eyes sharp and bright, the way old men's eyes sometimes are, as though age has taken everything else but left the eyes younger than ever. Have you heard? He said, not a question. He said many things as though they were not questions. Masha set a small loaf on the counter. Heard what, Dmitri Pavlovitch? The women. At the Viborg side. The textile workers. He picked up the bread and turned it in his hands admiringly, the way he always did, as if seeing bread for the first time. They've stopped working. They're in the streets. Masha felt something shift in her chest. Not quite fear. Not quite hope. Something between the two that had no comfortable name. In this cold? She said. In this cold, he confirmed. There is no bread over there, Masha Pavlovna. None at all. He said it simply, and the simplicity of it was worse than any outrage could have been. Just, no bread at all. She handed him his change and watched him go, and stood for a moment with her hands resting flat on the counter. No bread. She thought about what that meant, not as an abstraction, not as a political fact, but as a physical reality. She knew bread. She knew what it meant for a family to have it and to not have it. She knew the weight of a loaf in the hand, the specific warmth of it when it has just come from the oven, the way a child's face changes when they smell it. She knew what its absence meant in a way that perhaps only a baker can fully know. She went back to work. More customers came and went through the morning. A young woman with a baby wrapped so thoroughly in blankets that only its reddened nose was visible. 2 factory workers on their way to the shift, who bought half a loaf between them and ate it standing in the doorway, saying nothing, looking out at the street. A schoolteacher who said, very quietly, that the trams had stopped running on the Viborg side and that the crowds were very large. Masha listened and kneaded and listened. The snow fell outside the window in small, indifferent flakes. It fell on the street and on the rooftops and on the wide grey surface of the Neva, which was still frozen solid, as it had been since December, a great flat silence at the center of the city. By noon, she had sold almost everything. She stood in the quiet of the bakery, flour on her hands and her apron, and she looked at the nearly empty shelves. A few small rolls. Half a loaf. The ends of things. Through the window, she could see people moving in the street, not the ordinary movement of a working day, but something different. A clustering. A gathering. People stopping to talk, turning to look in the same direction, the way people turn when they have heard a sound they cannot quite identify. Masha untied her apron. She hung it on the hook behind the door. She put on her coat, the heavy dark wool one, the warmest she had, and wound her scarf twice around her neck. She took Pavel's shawl from the hook as well and folded it over her arm. Then she opened the door, and she stepped out into the cold, and she stood for a moment on the step of her bakery, in the falling snow, and she listened. From somewhere to the north, carried thin and distant on the frozen air, she could hear voices. Many voices. The voices from the north were not loud. That was the first thing Masha noticed. She had imagined in the vague, unexamined way you imagine things you have never seen that a crowd in the streets would be loud. Shouting. Sharp. The way a crowd sounds at a fire, or at a fight outside a tavern on a Saturday night. But this sound was different. It was low and continuous, like a river, like weather. It was the sound of many people making many small sounds all at once, and the combined effect was something almost geological, something that seemed to come not just from the north but from under the ground itself, from the frozen earth beneath the cobblestones. She stood on her step and listened for a long moment. Then old Dmitri Pavlovich's grandson, a boy of perhaps 12, quick-eyed and serious the way children become serious when they sense that the adults around them are frightened, came running through the courtyard gate and stopped when he saw her. "They are on the Litany Bridge," he said, breathless and bright. "Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. Women mostly, but men too now. Factory men." He said it with the barely suppressed excitement of a child who understands that something enormous is happening without yet understanding what enormous things cost. "They are walking toward the center. My grandfather says to stay inside, but I think—" "Go back to your grandfather," Masha said, not unkindly. The boy looked at her, then at the gate, then back at her. He went. Masha looked down at her hands. She was still holding Pavel's shawl. She realized it was still folded over her arm, dark blue with white flowers, worn thin at the edges. She didn't remember picking it up. Or perhaps she did. She smoothed it with her thumb and stood there a moment longer in the falling snow, weighing something she could not quite name. Then she locked the bakery door and walked toward the bridge. She heard them before she saw them. The sound grew as she walked north along Litany Prospect, growing fuller and more layered with each block, the way a piece of music grows as you walk toward its source, first just a sensation, then a murmur, then something that has texture and weight and can be felt as much as heard. She passed a pharmacy with its lights on and its owner standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching the street. She passed 2 soldiers walking quickly in the opposite direction, not looking at anyone. She passed a woman she didn't know who caught her eye and gave her a look of such complicated meaning, fear and defiance and exhaustion and something close to exhilaration, all at once, that Masha had to look away. And then she turned the corner and she saw them. She stopped walking. They filled the street from building front to building front, a river of dark coats and scarves and shawls, moving slowly southward across the bridge. She could see the Neva below, grey-white and still, and against it the dark moving mass of people looked almost unreal, like something from a painting, like something from the kind of dream that stays with you all day and changes the quality of the light. Most of them were women. This surprised her, even though Dmitri Pavlovich had said it, knowing a thing and seeing it are different operations. They were textile workers, she guessed. From the factories on the Vyborg side she could tell by the look of them, the particular kind of tiredness they carried, the way their hands moved even when they were still, as though they were always just about to reach for something. They walked with great seriousness. There was singing, somewhere in the middle of the crowd, a low, slow song she half recognized, one of the old ones, but most people were not singing. Most people were simply walking, their faces set, their breath rising in small clouds in the frozen air. Some of them were carrying signs. She squinted to read them. "Bread," said the nearest one. Just that. Just the one word. Masha felt something happen in her chest, a tightening, a loosening. She wasn't sure which. She thought about her nearly empty shelves. She thought about the careful measuring of flour that morning, the specific attention of a person who is not sure there will be more. She thought about the textile worker woman who had come in with the baby wrapped so completely in blankets, and about the 2 factory men who had stood in her doorway and eaten in silence, looking at the street. She thought, of course. She thought it the way you think something you have always known but never quite said aloud. Of course. She did not join the march. She was not sure exactly why. Partly fear, she was honest enough to admit it. Partly something more complicated, the instinct of a person who has learned to survive by being careful, by not drawing attention, by keeping her head down and her oven burning and her shelves as full as she could manage. Pavel used to tease her about it. "You are the most sensible woman in all of Russia," he would say, not always as a compliment. But she stood and she watched for a long time. She watched a grandmother walk past carrying nothing, no sign, no banner, just walking with the steadiness of someone who has decided something and will not be undecided. She watched a young man, perhaps 17, stride along with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set, his eyes moving over the buildings on either side of the street as if memorizing them. She watched a child, a little girl of perhaps 5, perched on her father's shoulders looking out over the crowd with an expression of absolute wonder, as though she were watching a river appear where there had never been a river before. The snow kept falling. It fell on the crowd and it fell on the bridge and it fell on the frozen Neva below, and it made everything soft at the edges, and it fell on Masha's shoulders and on Pavel's shawl where it lay across her arm, and she stood in it and watched until the feeling in her feet began to fade from cold and she knew she should go back. She went back to the bakery by a different route, through the smaller streets. The smaller streets were quiet. Eerily so, perhaps that particular quiet of a place from which noise has been recently drained, where the absence of sound is itself a kind of sound. A cat watched her from a window. A cart horse stood motionless at a hitching post, its breath making great plumes of steam, its eyes patient and dark and full of some unbothered wisdom that Masha briefly envied. She let herself back into the bakery and stood in the warmth for a moment, unwinding her scarf. Then she did something she had not planned to do. She went to the sacks of flour, the careful, rationed sacks, and she measured out a larger portion than she had intended. She worked it into dough with hands that moved quickly, without hesitation, as though the decision had already been made somewhere below the level of thought. She shaped the loaves with care, the way she always did, pressing and folding with the attention that Pavel's father had taught Pavel, and Pavel had taught her. Treat the dough as though it matters, he used to say, because it does. She slid the loaves into the oven. Then she sat down on the low wooden stool beside the warmth, and she looked at her hands, resting in her lap, flour still caught in the creases of her knuckles. She thought about the woman with the sign. Just the one word. She thought, I cannot march. I am one person. I have flour enough for perhaps 2 more weeks if I am careful, and after that I do not know. She thought, I am not brave in the way that those women are brave. She thought, Pavel would have known what to do. Pavel always knew what to do. But Pavel was not here. And she had put extra flour in the dough. And in an hour there would be more bread. And tomorrow morning, whoever came to her door would find her open, and there would be something on the shelf. That was what she could do. That was the shape of her particular courage, modest and flour-dusted and warm. She sat with that for a while. Outside, the distant sound of the crowd had not stopped. It moved through the walls of the bakery like a slow current, not threatening, exactly, but insistent, like the sound of a river that has decided to find a new course and has begun the long, patient work of doing so. The oven breathed its amber warmth. The dough was rising. Masha sat on her stool and let her eyes grow heavy, and she may have dozed just briefly, just at the surface of sleep, where you are still aware of the warmth and the smell and the distant sound of the world, but the edges of things have gone soft and kind. She dreamed, if it was dreaming, of Pavel's hands. They were large hands, the hands of a man who had worked with them all his life, with flour permanently in the creases just as hers were now. In the dream he was standing at the oven with his back to her, and she was about to say his name, and then the bell above the bakery door rang and she was awake. A woman stood in the doorway. A textile worker's face, the particular tiredness, the particular set of the jaw. Her coat was damp with snow. She looked at the empty shelves and her face did something small and private that she quickly rearranged. I'm sorry, the woman said. I can see you've. The bread isn't done yet, Masha said. But it won't be long. Will you wait? The woman looked at her. Then she came in and closed the door behind her, and stood by the oven, and let the warmth come into her hands, and said nothing. And Masha said nothing either. And the snow fell outside, and the oven breathed, and somewhere to the north the river of people moved slowly through the frozen city, finding its way. The thing that nobody talked about afterward, or not enough, Masha always thought, was how ordinary the extraordinary days felt while you were inside them. People would ask her later, what was it like? When the soldiers came over to the people's side, when the Cossacks refused to fire, what did it feel like? And she would try to explain, and mostly fail, that it did not feel like history. It felt like weather. It felt like the particular quality of those days, the cold that had begun, almost imperceptibly, to relent, the light that was staying a few minutes longer each evening, the smell of the city shifting in some way she could not name. It felt like all of that, and underneath it, threaded through it, this slow and enormous thing happening, like ice moving on a river so large that you could not see it whole, only feel the pressure of it. She had kept the bakery open through all of it. This was, she understood, a small act in the scale of what was occurring. The streets had filled and emptied and filled again. There had been gunshots she had heard from the bakery, distant and irregular, like someone dropping things in the apartment above. She had locked the door during the worst of it and sat in the back room with her hands around a glass of tea, listening, and when it grew quiet she unlocked the door again and put what she had on the shelf. Bread. She could make bread. So she made bread. It was on the 4th day that the soldier came in. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 19 or 20, with a kind of face that had not yet fully decided what it was going to look like. He was wearing his uniform, but he had removed whatever insignia there had been from the collar, and she noticed this without remarking on it. He stood at the counter with his hands at his sides and looked at the shelf and said nothing. "How much do you have?" he asked, finally. "2 loaves," Masha said. "And some rolls." He looked at her directly then. He had very pale eyes, grey or perhaps blue, and they held something she recognized, not quite desperation, not quite relief, something suspended between the two. He reached into his coat and she saw him count what he had. "I'll take a roll," he said. And he stopped. Started again. "Is there anywhere nearby? For the others?" "How many others?" He hesitated. 11. Masha looked at him for a moment. Then she reached under the counter and brought out the loaf she had been keeping back, the one she baked at midnight and set aside for herself, from habit, from the instinct of a person who has learned not to rely on anything being available later. "Take this," she said. "Don't tell me what you are doing with it. I don't need to know." He looked at the loaf. He looked at her. His face did something complicated, a tightening around the eyes, a brief unsteadiness of the jaw, and then he collected himself with the visible effort of a young man who has decided he will not be seen to feel things. "Thank you," he said. It came out roughly. "Go," she said, not unkindly. He went. She stood for a moment with her hands on the counter. She did not know which side he was on, the old side or the new side, the Tsar's men or the people's men. She had not asked. Bread did not ask, she thought. Bread was bread. You made it and you gave it and it was eaten, and that was its whole purpose, and it did not require her to know the politics of the hands that received it. Pavel would have agreed with this, she was nearly certain. The news about the Tsar came on a Thursday. It came the way news came in those days, sideways, incomplete, through the mouths of neighbors and customers and people passing in the street, each version slightly different from the last, so that you could not be entirely sure what was true and what was rumor and what was the thing people hoped was true, spoken aloud so many times that it had taken on the quality of fact. Dmitri Pavlovitch came in first, as he always did. "He has abdicated," the old man said, setting his coin on the counter with the particular care of a man who knows the weight of what he is saying. Masha stopped what she was doing. "You're certain?" "As certain as anything," he said. "At Pskov. He signed it on the train." He picked up his bread and turned it in his hands, as he always did. His face was very still. "On the train," he said again, as though this detail particularly struck him, that the thing had happened not in the Winter Palace, not in some room of gilt and marble as one might have imagined, but on a train, somewhere out in the snow. After he left, Masha stood in the bakery and tried to feel what she was supposed to feel. She was not sure what that was. She had not loved the Tsar, was not sure she had ever had strong feelings about him in either direction, which perhaps said something about how remote he had always seemed, as remote as the weather or the turning of the year, a force that shaped your life without ever making itself present in it. She had known women who prayed for him, genuinely, with feeling. She had known men who despised him with a passion that had kept them warm through more than one winter. She had mostly just tried to get the flour. But she stood in the silence of the bakery and she felt something. It was not joy and it was not grief and it was not quite fear, though fear was somewhere in it. It was more like the feeling of a door swinging open, a large, heavy door, long stuck, that has suddenly moved, and what is on the other side of it you cannot yet see because the light is different there, the air is different, and you need a moment for your eyes to adjust. She put another log in the oven. That evening, the streets were extraordinary. She went out after closing. She was not sure why, only that she could not stay inside, could not sleep, could not simply sit with the ordinary objects of the bakery and the silence. She wrapped herself in her coat and Pavel's shawl and she walked. Petrograd had come outside. This was the only way she could describe it. The city, which had spent the whole winter locked away from itself, each person in their own coat, their own hunger, their own small private management of survival, had come outside and was standing in its own streets looking at itself with a kind of wondering uncertainty, as though seeing the place for the first time. There were fires burning in metal drums at the corners of the great avenues, and people stood around them with their hands out, not speaking much, just present, just there. She passed a group of factory workers sharing a bottle of something and singing one of the old songs, not a revolutionary song, just an old song, the kind that had been sung so long it had lost its particular meaning and become simply a vehicle for the feeling of singing together. She passed two women who were embracing in the middle of the pavement, both of them crying, though whether from joy or grief or relief or simply the overwhelming weight of the day she could not tell, and perhaps they could not either. She walked to the Neva. She stood at the embankment and looked out at the river. It was still frozen, but something had changed in its quality. She could not say what, exactly. Perhaps it was the light, the particular way the fires on the bridges were reflected in the white surface. Perhaps it was something she was imagining. But it seemed to her that the ice had a different texture than it had a week ago, a different solidity, as though somewhere very deep below it, the water had remembered that it was water. She stood there for a long time. She thought about Pavel. She did this less deliberately now than she had in the early months. Grief changes its nature over time. She had found, becomes less a wound and more a weather, something that is simply present in varying intensities, that you move through rather than endure. She thought about what he would have said tonight. He was not a political man, Pavel, but he had a clear eye for the difference between what people said and what they meant, and for what mattered underneath all of it. They'll fight about it now, she could hear him say. Everyone will want to be the one who decides what comes next. That's when the real trouble starts. She smiled, there alone in the cold, at the sound of him in her head. Yes, she thought back. But right now it's tonight. Right now the ice is still on the river and the fires are burning on the bridges and nobody has started fighting yet. Right now it's just this. She looked up. The sky above the city was a particular shade of deep blue-black, and through the smoke of the fires and the pale haze of the snow clouds there were stars, not many, just a few, but there. Small and cold and very far away and utterly indifferent to the Tsar and to the revolution and to Masha Sorokina standing at the embankment with her dead husband's mother's shawl around her shoulders. She found this comforting, oddly. The stars not caring. It put the size of things into proportion. She turned and walked home. She slept that night more deeply than she had slept in months. She was not sure why. The world was more uncertain than it had been yesterday. That was simply true. There was no use denying it. The flour was still running low. The war was still happening somewhere to the west, devouring men and horses and resources with an appetite that did not seem to diminish. The future was a room with the door now open and she still could not see what was in it. And yet, she slept. She lay down in the cold bedroom with the small stove barely warm, wrapped in every blanket she had, and she closed her eyes, and the darkness came up gently to meet her like deep water, and she went down into it without resistance. She did not dream of Pavel this time. She dreamed of bread, of the specific moment when the dough has proofed and is ready, when you press it gently with one finger and it springs back slowly, slowly, with a kind of patient certainty, the way something alive springs back when you press it, telling you, I am ready. I am ready. I am ready. April came in on a cold bright wind off the Gulf of Finland, and with it came Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Masha did not see him arrive. She was at the bakery, as she always was, flour on her hands, the oven breathing its slow warmth, the morning customers coming and going with their particular faces and their particular silences. But she heard about it, as everyone heard about it, in that sideways accumulating way that news moved through the city. He had come on a train from Switzerland, through Germany, through Finland, and then into the Finland station on the Viborg side, where a crowd had gathered to meet him, and there had been speeches and torches and an armored car, and the sound of it, the sound of that arrival, that return had moved through Petrograd like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples going out and out. She heard different things from different people about what it meant. The young man who bought bread every morning on his way to the print works said it meant that now things would really begin, that the provisional government was a half measure, a temporizing, a way of keeping the old arrangements in new clothes, and that what was needed was something more complete, more honest about what it actually was. Old Dmitri Pavlovich said, turning his loaf in his hands with his customary reverence, that he had heard this kind of talk before, from other men, and that the ones who were most certain about what history required had a tendency to require a great many things from ordinary people in the process. The textile worker woman Moshe had learned her name now, Galina Ivanovna. She came every few days, and they had developed the particular friendship of two people who are not sure yet how much they trust each other but who keep showing up anyway. Galina said simply that she was tired, that she had been tired for a very long time, and that she would believe things were changing when she could feed her children without choosing which one ate more. Moshe listened to all of them and said little. This was her way. She had decided some time ago that the bakery was a place where people could say what they thought without it being debated or judged, and she maintained this with the quiet firmness of a woman who has decided something and will not be easily undecided. People seemed to sense it. They talked to her in the way that people sometimes talk to priests, or to rivers, not expecting a response, exactly, just needing the saying of it. But spring was not only politics. This was the thing she held on to through those complicated months, the thing she returned to when the noise of the city's arguing became too much, that spring was also just spring, regardless of what was happening inside it. The light was the first thing. It came back so gradually that you almost didn't notice until one morning you realized that when you woke before dawn to start the oven, it was no longer entirely dark, that there was something at the edges of the sky, not quite color, just the suggestion of color, the memory of it, and you stood in the doorway of the bakery for a moment longer than you needed to, just to feel it. Then the day the ice broke, she heard it from inside, a sound like very distant thunder, a deep slow cracking, and she went to the window and she could not see the river from there, but she knew immediately what it was. She took off her apron and went to the embankment, flour still on her hands, and she stood with a dozen other people who had also come out at the sound, all of them watching the great gray plates of ice shifting and grinding against each other, beginning their slow procession toward the sea. It was, she thought, one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. Not pretty, it was not a pretty sight. It was vast and slightly violent, and the sound of it was tremendous, a deep groaning and splintering that you felt in your chest as much as heard with your ears. But beautiful in the way that true things are beautiful, in the way that something that has been held for too long and is now released is beautiful. She stood there until her feet were completely numb. A man beside her, she had never seen him before, a large man with a docker's hands and a good coat that was slightly too small for him, said, without looking at her, "Every year it surprises me." "Yes," she said. "Every year you know it's coming, and then it comes and it still surprises you." "Yes," she said again. They stood a while longer and then went their separate ways without another word, and that was enough, that was exactly enough. She started keeping a small notebook that spring. She was not sure what made her begin it. She was not a writer. She had left school at 14, had read enough to manage the bakery's accounts and to work through a newspaper when she had time, which was rarely. But something in those days made her want to set things down, to make some record of what was being lived through, as though she could feel the weight of it and wanted to mark that weight somehow. She wrote about the customers, about Galina and her children, about the young man from the print works, whose name was Alexei, and who had a habit of talking about the future with such detailed certainty that she sometimes wanted to ask him how he knew, how anyone could know, but she never did. She wrote about Dmitri Pavlovich's size. She wrote about the soldier with the pale gray eyes who had taken the midnight loaf and said thank you in that rough voice and never come back, and whether he was all right, wherever he was. She wrote about Pavel, sometimes. Not every day. Not in any organized way. Just when something happened that she wanted to tell him and the wanting had nowhere else to go. The river broke today, she wrote, in her careful, slightly effortful hand. You would have come to see it. You always did. I thought of you standing next to me and I was glad, for a moment, and then sad in the ordinary way, and then just glad again. I am learning to let those things sit next to each other. She closed the notebook and put it under the counter and went back to the dough. It was in May that she first felt the shift. It was not a dramatic thing. It did not announce itself. It was more like the change in the quality of light before a storm, subtle enough that you could almost dismiss it, almost tell yourself you were imagining, and yet persistent enough that it stayed with you, a slight unease at the back of ordinary moments. The arguments in the city were growing less abstract. This was how she first noticed it. Through the winter and the early spring, the talk had been large and sweeping about history, about justice, about what Russia was and what it ought to become. The words had been grand. Even the disagreements had been grand, full of references to things and names and ideas that Masha only half followed and did not always need to, because the feeling beneath the words was clear enough. Something has ended, something new must begin. What shall it be? But by May the arguments had gotten smaller and sharper and more personal. People were angrier. The provisional government had decided to continue the war. This she understood. This she could follow, and men were still being sent to the western fronts and coming back, changed or not coming back at all. And the anger about this was not abstract. It was not a political position. It was the anger of women who had lost husbands and mothers who had lost sons, and it was the oldest and most justified anger in the world. And there was still not enough bread. This was the thing that she came back to, always, because she understood it in her hands, in her flour sacks, in the careful measuring she still did every morning. The supply lines were still broken. The organization of things was still uncertain. Whatever the revolution had changed, it had not yet changed the simple calculus of how much flour was available and how many mouths needed feeding, and this calculus was not improving. Galina came in one afternoon and sat on the stool by the oven. She did this sometimes now, just sat, and Masha let her, and she said, very quietly, "My Petya has been called up." Masha stopped what she was doing. Petya was Galina's eldest. She had met him once, a serious boy of 16 with his mother's same set jaw. "He's not old enough," Masha said. "He's 17 now," Galina said. "They say 17 is old enough." They were both quiet for a long time. The oven breathed. Outside, a cart went past on the cobblestones, and a man shouted something to someone across the street, and a child laughed at something, a high clear sound, quickly gone. "I thought," Galina said, very carefully, as though choosing each word from a limited supply. "I thought that was supposed to be what changed. I thought that was what all of it was for." Masha did not say anything, because there was nothing to say. She took the bread that had just come out of the oven, still too hot. Really, you were supposed to let it rest, and she cut 2 thick slices and put them on the counter between them. They ate in silence. It was good bread, Masha thought. That was still true. Whatever else was uncertain, the bread was good. The flour was running low again, and the next delivery was not guaranteed, and the price had gone up 3 times since January, and the bread was still good. And she was still here, and Galina was still here, and outside the window the spring light was doing what spring light does, falling on everything equally, on the bakery and the street and the river and the city, indifferent to its politics, concerned only with the ancient business of returning after absence, of making things warm again, of insisting, without argument, that another day had come. "Will he go?" Masha asked, finally. Galina looked at the window. "I don't know," she said. "He says he won't." "But he's 17. She said this last part not bitterly, just truthfully, the way you say something you have simply decided to accept. 17-year-olds say many things. That evening Masha wrote in her notebook. She wrote, "Something is tightening. I don't know what to call it." The spring was supposed to be something, and it was something, the river, the light, all of it, but it was also not what people needed it to be. People needed it to solve things, and it is only spring. It can only do what spring can do. She paused, and then she wrote, "I think Pavel was right. I think this is when the real argument starts. I think what we have had so far was only the part before the argument, the part where everyone still believes they want the same thing." She stopped. She read what she had written. Then she closed the notebook. Outside the window, Petrograd was settling into its brief northern dusk, that long, slow, luminous fading that in summer barely reaches darkness before the light begins again, as though the city exists in a season of its own, between night and day, between one thing and the next, always in the middle of becoming something it has not yet fully become. She banked the oven for the night. She went upstairs. She lay down and pulled the blankets close and listened to the city, its carts and its voices and its distant arguments and its river, moving now, free of ice, carrying the winter away toward the sea. Still here, she thought, as she did each night, meaning herself, meaning the bakery, meaning still, even now Pavel, in whatever way the dead remain. Still here, still warm, still bread in the morning. She slept. She heard it begin at 2 in the morning. She had been sleeping lightly, she slept lightly now. Most nights, one eye always open in the way of a person who has learned that the city has moods and that its moods can change quickly and without announcement. So when the guns started, she was awake almost before the sound had fully formed, sitting up in the dark with her heart going fast and steady, listening. It was not close. That was the first thing she established. The sound was coming from the west, from the direction of the river, from somewhere near the Winter Palace. She knew the city well enough now to read its sounds directionally, the way a sailor reads wind. It was a deep, percussive sound, irregular, with gaps of silence between that were somehow worse than the noise itself, because in the gaps you strained to hear what was happening and heard only the dark. She did not go to the window. She sat in her bed with her knees drawn up and Pavel's shawl around her shoulders, and she listened, and she counted her own breathing, and she waited. The guns were the aurora. She learned this in the morning, in the accumulating sideways way she had come to understand as the city's particular method of telling itself things. The aurora was a cruiser. She had a vague image of it, grey and massive, sitting in the Neva, and its guns had fired a blank round at the Winter Palace as a signal, as a beginning, and after that the Bolsheviks had moved through the city in the night, and by morning the provisional government was finished and the Winter Palace was taken and the world was, again, different. A blank round, people kept saying. It was only a blank. As though this were the important thing. As though the world cared about the distinction. Alexei, the young man from the print works, came in that morning with his eyes bright and his face carrying the particular expression of a person who has been awake all night and does not feel it yet, who is still running on the energy of events. "It's done," he said, before she had even set his bread on the counter. "The Soviet has power. It's actually done." "Is anyone hurt?" she said. He blinked. The question seemed to arrive from a direction he hadn't been expecting. "Some," he said, more carefully. "Not many. It was mostly peaceful. Mostly." He picked up his bread. His hands, she noticed, were not quite steady. "It was mostly peaceful," he said again, as though reassuring himself as much as her. She nodded and gave him his change, and he went out into the October morning, and she watched him go, and she thought, he believes it. He genuinely believes it is done. And she did not know whether to find this hopeful or heartbreaking, because she had lived long enough to know that nothing as large as this is ever done, that what people call endings are mostly just the places where they stop being able to see what comes next. But she also remembered the women crossing the bridge in February, the sign that said only bread, the textile worker's face and the specific tiredness in it. And she thought, something had to change. Something had to. And she held both of these things together the way she had learned to hold things, not resolving them, not choosing between them, just letting them sit side by side in the same chest like two loaves in the same oven, each one its own thing, each one necessary. Galina came in the afternoon. She came in quietly, the way she often did, and sat on the stool and said nothing for a while. Masha worked around her, finding the comfortable rhythm of two people who have been in the same room enough times that they no longer need to fill the silence. Petya came home, Galina said, eventually. Masha looked up. Last week. Galina's hands were in her lap. He deserted. He walked away from the front and came home. She said this flatly, without drama, the way you say a thing you have already said to yourself many times and have run out of ways to feel about. I don't know what happens to him now. With the new government. I don't know what the rules are. He's alive, Masha said. He's alive, Galina agreed. She said it the way Moshe had, as a fact, as a thing that was simply and entirely true and that contained within it everything that needed to be said about the matter. They were quiet again. Outside, Petrograd went about its extraordinary ordinary business, carts and voices, and the distant sound of the river, which was still moving, had been moving since the ice broke in April, would keep moving through whatever came next. Somewhere several streets away a group of men were shouting, political shouting, the kind with a rhythm to it that meant it was organized, rehearsed, pointed at something specific. The sound rose and then faded as they moved away. "Do you think it will be better?" Galina asked. She was not asking politically. She was asking the way a tired woman asks when she has a son who deserted and children who need feeding and a body that has been tired for so long it has stopped remembering what not tired feels like. She was asking, "Will there be bread? Will there be enough? Will my boy be safe? Will I be able to rest?" Moshe was quiet for a moment. "I think," she said, slowly, "that some things will be better. And I think some things will be harder before they are better." She paused. "I think it will be a long time before we know which is which." Galina looked at her. Then she nodded, once, with the nod of a woman who has heard an honest answer and prefers it to a comfortable one. "Yes," she said. "I thought so too." Moshe wrote in her notebook that night. She sat at the small table in the back room of the bakery with a candle. The electricity had been uncertain for 2 days, another consequence of the night's events, of the switches of control over various parts of the city's infrastructure, and she wrote by the moving light, her handwriting less careful than usual, loosened by tiredness. October 26th, she wrote. Or the 25th by the old calendar. They haven't decided yet what to do about the calendars, which seems right, somehow. Even time is being argued over. There were guns in the night. I lay in bed and listened and counted my breathing and waited for it to be over, and eventually it was. This morning the city looked exactly the same and completely different, the way cities do after things happen in them. The cobblestones were the same cobblestones. The sky was the same October sky, gray and high and indifferent. But the air had a different quality, the way air does after lightning charged, still, aware of itself. She stopped and looked at the candle flame. It moved in some small draft she couldn't identify, bending and recovering, bending and recovering. "I keep thinking about what Pavel said," she wrote, "that this is when the real argument starts. I think he was right. I think we are at the beginning of something very long. I don't know what it will ask of us, of me, of Galina, of Alexei with his bright eyes and his certainty, of old Dmitri Pavlovitch who has seen too much to be surprised and too much to stop being sad about it. I know what I can do. I've always known. I can keep the oven burning. I can measure carefully and make what I have lost. I can open the door in the morning and put what I have on the shelf and not ask the politics of the hands that take it. It is not much," she wrote, "but it is not nothing. Pavel always said, don't mistake small for unimportant. Bread is small. Bread is everything." She closed the notebook. She sat for a while longer by the candle, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting, just present, just a woman in a bakery in a city in the middle of its own becoming, listening to the quiet. It was very quiet. The guns were long finished. The shouting in the streets had died away. Even the river seemed to have hushed itself, or perhaps she simply could not hear it from here, from this back room with its familiar smell of flour and warmth and the particular smell of the candle tallow, slightly smoky, the smell of old winters. The smell of before electricity, she thought. The smell of every winter in every city before anyone thought to harness light. She thought about the women crossing the bridge in February. 8 months ago. It felt like 8 years. It felt like 8 days. Time had done strange things this year, compressed and expanded in ways that made the ordinary calendar seem like an insufficient tool for measuring what had actually been lived. February felt like something that had happened to a different person, someone younger, someone who had not yet stood at the embankment and watched the ice break, had not yet stood in the long pale summer nights and felt the city's uncertainty pressing against her like a physical thing, had not yet lain in bed listening to guns and counted her breathing and waited. And yet she was the same person. The same hands that had kneaded dough in February were the same hands she was looking at now, resting on the closed notebook. The same flour in the same creases of the same knuckles. She thought, we are all different now. And we are all exactly the same. Both of these things are true and neither cancels the other. She thought, Pavel would have said something better than that. Shorter. He was always better at the short version. She smiled in the candlelight. All right, she thought to him. You say it then. And she sat in the quiet and she let the quiet answer, and it was enough, it was exactly enough, the way the silence after a long piece of music is itself a kind of music, the way the dark after a candle is blown out holds the memory of the light for just a moment, warm and fading, warm and fading. She blew out the candle. She went upstairs. She lay down. The city outside her window was silent, that particular silence that follows enormous events, that is not empty but saturated, full of everything that has just happened, full of everything that is about to. Somewhere the river was still moving. Somewhere the stars were doing their ancient indifferent work. Somewhere a boy named Petya was asleep under his mother's roof, alive, having walked away from a war, uncertain of everything except that he had come home. Somewhere in the cold, dark city, in apartments and barracks and palaces and print works and factories and back rooms, 10,000 people were lying down in the ruins and the beginnings of their new world, wondering what morning would bring. And in the bakery on Litany Prospect, Masha Suokina pulled her blankets close and closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would rise before the light. She would put on her apron and measure the flour carefully, always carefully, and she would work the dough with her hands, the long slow push of it, and she would slide the loaves into the oven and she would wait, as she always waited, for the moment when the smell changed from raw to ready, from promise to fact. She would open the door. She would see who came. Still here, she thought, in the last moment before sleep. Still warm. Still bread in the morning. The dark came up to meet her. She let it. She woke before the light, as she always did. The darkness in the bedroom was complete and familiar. The particular darkness of deep winter in the north, the kind that has weight and texture, that presses gently against your eyes as though reminding you it is still there, still in charge, not ready yet to give way to morning. She lay still for a moment in the way she had learned to lie still, not with the old grief weight of the early months after Pavel, not with the anxious listening of the revolutionary months, but simply still, present, here. She had been learning, slowly, over this long year, how to be in the moment she was actually in. It was harder than it sounded. She rose. The floor was cold through her stockings. She wrapped Pavel's shawl around her shoulders, dark blue, white flowers, worn thin at the edges and softer for it, softer than it had ever been when it was new, the way things sometimes become more themselves with use and time. She moved through the apartment in the dark, by memory, by the shape of the silence. Down the stairs. The hip push at the stuck door. Into the bakery. The oven was waiting. She opened the iron door and fed it slowly, with care, the way you tend anything alive, the way you tend anything that gives warmth in exchange for attention. She watched the fire catch and settle and deepen, the amber glow spreading outward into the dark room, touching the shelves and the counter and the hanging aprons and the familiar tools of her trade with its particular gold. She pressed her hands to the iron. There you are. Outside, December was doing what December does in Petrograd, which is to say everything, and at once. Snow was falling, had been falling for 2 days without stopping, the soft, relentless, accumulating kind that muffles the city's edges and makes everything quieter and further away and somehow more bearable. The cobblestones were buried. The window ledges carried their thick white lines. The Neva was freezing again. She knew this without seeing it, felt it in the quality of the cold, in the way the air had that particular stillness it gets when the water is going still. The wheel had turned. Winter again. She had not expected, back in February, to feel anything like relief at winter's return. But she did. She was surprised to find a small and quiet relief, the way you feel returning to a place that is difficult but known. The revolutionary months had been so many things: terrifying, extraordinary, exhausting, occasionally beautiful in the way that enormous events can be beautiful even as they break things. But they had not been restful. Not a single day of them had been restful. She had lived them with her whole body, every nerve engaged, every morning opening her eyes into uncertainty. Winter, at least, she understood. Winter she knew how to live in. She began the dough. The flour situation had stabilized slightly, tenuously, in the way that things in Petrograd stabilized, which was always with the awareness that it could change again, would likely change again, and that the only reasonable response to a period of enough was to be grateful for it while it lasted and careful enough that when it didn't last you would not be entirely undone. She measured. She poured. She began to work. The rhythm of it was, as always, the oldest thing in her day, older than the revolution, older than grief, older than any of the ideas that people had been arguing about all year in the streets and the meeting halls and the print works and the kitchens and the bakeries of Petrograd. This rhythm, the heel of the hand pushing forward, the fingers curling, the turn and fold, the heel again. Women had done this in Russia for 1,000 years. They had done it through invasions and famines and the deaths of Tsars. They had done it in winters as cold as this one, in kitchens smaller than this one, with less flour and more fear. They had done it and the bread had risen and the morning had come. She found this, as she always did, deeply steadying. Not comforting exactly. Not a denial of the difficulty of things. More like context. The long view. The reminder that she was one person in one bakery in one moment of a very long story, and that the story had room in it for all of it, the grief and the revolution and the bread and the river and the stars, and had been going on before her and would go on after her and did not require her to carry it alone. She was just here to make the bread. She made the bread. Dmitri Pavlovich came at 7, as he always did. He came in stamping snow from his boots, his beard white with frost, his eyes sharp and bright. He was wearing the same coat he had worn every winter she had known him. He would probably wear it until he died, she thought, and then whoever arranged his things would have difficulty deciding what to do with it because it would be so completely his that it would seem almost rude to give it away. Masha Pavlovna, he said, by way of greeting. Dmitri Pavlovich, she said, by way of reply. He looked at the shelf. He looked at the bread she had just brought out, still resting, the crust of it crackling softly as it cooled, that small ticking sound that new bread makes, like a clock, like a heartbeat. Good, he said. She cut him his loaf. He put his coin on the counter. He picked up the bread and held it for a moment in both hands, feeling the weight of it, the warmth of it, and his face did what it always did, that expression of careful, private appreciation, as though each loaf was still a small miracle worth acknowledging. The meetings on Vasilievsky Island last night, he said, not quite a question. I didn't go, she said. No. He turned the bread in his hands. I didn't either. He said this without apology. He was too old for apology. They will manage without us for one night. She almost smiled. Will they? They'll manage without us for all the nights, he said, dryly. That is both the trouble with the young and their greatest gift. He tucked the loaf under his arm. They don't know yet that they need the old ones. By the time they find out, they'll be old ones themselves. He said this without bitterness, just as observation, just as a man who has lived long enough to have watched the pattern repeat. Good bread, he added, already moving toward the door. Every morning, she said. Every morning, he agreed, and went out into the snow. Galina came mid-morning. She came with both her children, the younger two, Vera and the small one they called Misha, Vera holding Misha's hand and both of them dusted with snow, their cheeks red from the cold, their eyes bright with the specific pleasure of children in snow, which is a pleasure that seems to exist independent of any other circumstance, impervious to history, to difficulty, to the temperature, to everything except the snow itself. Say good morning to Masha, Galina said. Good morning, said Vera, very seriously. Misha said nothing but looked at Moshe with enormous dark eyes and then looked at the bread on the shelf with the same enormous eyes, which was its own kind of greeting. Moshe cut 2 small rolls and held them out, one in each hand, and the children took them with the gravity of a ritual and began to eat immediately, standing right there, because when you are small and cold and there is bread there is no reason to wait. Galina watched them. Her face in that moment was very simple. It was the face of a woman looking at her children eating bread, and it held everything: the exhaustion and the love and the worry and the specific complicated gratitude of having made it through something that you were not certain you would make it through. Petya found work, she said quietly, while the children were occupied at the tram depot, maintaining the lines. Good, Moshe said. It's not much. It's something. Yes. Galina watched Misha trying to eat faster than physically possible. It's something. She paid for the rolls and gathered the children and went to the door, and there she paused and turned back, and she looked at Moshe for a moment with that look she sometimes had, frank and measuring and warm underneath, like a fire behind glass. Thank you, she said, for all of it. The year of it. Moshe shook her head. You kept showing up, she said. That was you. I just kept the door open. Galina looked at her a moment longer. Then she nodded, once, and took her children out into the snow. The afternoon was quiet. A few more customers came and went. The young man Alexei stopped in, slightly less bright-eyed than he had been in October. The particular brightness of that morning dimmed somewhat into something more tempered, more considered, not defeated, not disillusioned, just adjusted, the way a person's vision adjusts when they move from a very bright room into ordinary light. He talked less about the future. He asked how she was. She told him fine. He said he was fine too, in the way that people say it when they mean something more complicated than fine but have not yet found the words for it, or are not sure the words exist. She gave him extra bread. He noticed and didn't say anything, and she didn't explain, and they both understood, and that was enough. At 4 o'clock the light was already going. This was December in the north, the sky beginning its slow fade before the afternoon was finished, the blue deepening, the shadows under the eaves growing long and blue, the street outside the window taking on that amber quality it got when the last of the day's light reflected off the snow, everything golden and going, golden and going. She closed the bakery. She washed her hands at the basin, working the flour from the creases of her knuckles with the particular attention she always gave to this, the end-of-day ritual of it. She dried them on the cloth that hung by the basin. She untied her apron and hung it on its hook. Then she did something she had not planned to do and had somehow known all day she would do. She took her notebook from under the counter. She put on her coat and wound her scarf and took Pavel's shawl. She went out into the December dusk, into the snow still falling softly, and she walked to the Neva. The embankment was empty. Of course it was December, it was nearly dark. The temperature was the kind that kept sensible people indoors. But she stood there anyway, as she had stood in October, as she had stood in April, as she had stood through all the long seasons of this impossible year, and she looked out at the river. It was nearly frozen. Not quite, not yet. In the very center, where the current ran deepest and strongest, there was still a dark line of moving water, narrow but present, still finding its way through, still going. Around it the ice had formed, and she could see it in the fading light, the gray-white plates of it spreading slowly inward from the banks, patient and inevitable. A few more days. A week. And the river would be silent again until April. But not yet. Tonight, still, that dark thread of moving water in the center, still going, still carrying whatever it carried, the cold, the sky, the reflection of the last light down toward the gulf and the sea. She opened her notebook. She had not planned what to write. She stood in the cold with the notebook open and the pencil in her hand, and she let the cold and the river and the fading light tell her what to say. She wrote, December. The river is almost frozen, but not quite. There is still a line of open water in the middle. I think about it all year, this moment, the going and the coming back, the ice and the thaw and the ice again. It seemed like a metaphor for so long. Now it just seems like the river.
She paused.
Her breath rose in small clouds.
It has been the strangest year of my life.
The longest.
The most.
I don't know what comes next. I don't think anyone does. Not honestly. Not the ones who say they do.
I know that there will be more arguments. More cold.
More mornings before the light when I will lie in bed and listen to the city and wait.
I know that I will keep the oven burning.
That I will measure carefully and make what I have lost.
That I will open the door in the morning. She stopped. She looked at the river, at that dark moving thread.
Pavel, she wrote.
I think I understand now what you meant.
You used to say, do the thing in front of you.
Don't try to hold the whole thing. Just do the thing in front of you. The thing in front of me is bread. It is always bread.
And maybe that is enough. Maybe that is exactly enough, and I have been looking for something larger when the thing itself, the flower, the warmth, the hands, the morning, maybe the thing itself is what I was looking for.
She closed the notebook.
She stood for a little while longer in the snow, in the cold, in the almost dark, and she let the year be what it had been, all of it, the grief of it and the terror of it and the strange beauty of it, the women on the bridge and the ice breaking and the guns in the night and Galina's face watching her children eat, all of it, and she did not try to resolve it or conclude it or understand it fully, because it was not that kind of thing.
It was a year. It had happened. She had lived it. She was still here.
She put Pavel's shawl to her face for just a moment and breathed in the smell of it, which was the smell of wool and cold air, and faintly, very faintly, something she could not name, something that might have been imagined. Then she tucked it back around her arm and turned from the river.
She walked home through the snow.
The bakery was dark when she got back, but the oven still held its warmth. She could feel it as soon as she opened the door, that living warmth, the breath of it.
She did not light a lamp.
She stood in the dark of the bakery and let the warmth find her, let it come into her hands and her face and her tired shoulders. Let it do what warmth does, which is simply this: remind you that you are a creature that can be warmed, that the cold is not the only thing, that something somewhere is always still burning. She banked the oven for the night with the care she always gave it.
She went upstairs. She lay down. And here is where we leave her.
Not at a moment of resolution. History does not offer those, not clean ones, not ones that hold. Not at a moment of triumph or of grief. Just here, in this ordinary moment, in the dark of a December bedroom in Petrograd, 1917, a woman pulling her blankets close against the cold, her hands smelling of flour and the river, the city outside her window quiet under its snow.
She did not know what the next year would bring.
None of them did, not Alexei with his bright eyes, not Galina with her tired ones, not old Dmitri Pavlovitch with his sharp ones. They would live it as they had lived this, one day by day, morning by morning, one loaf at a time.
But tonight there was only this: the dark, the warmth,
the snow falling on Petrograd, falling on the river, falling on the rooftops and the bridges and the frozen streets, falling on the embankment where she had stood, falling on the water that was still moving, just barely still moving, in the very center of the river where the current ran deepest.
Still here, she thought. Still warm. Bread in the morning. And she slept. And so do you. Let the bakery go now.
Let Petrograd go. Let 1917 go, all its weight, all its cold, all its impossible beauty. Let it drift away from you like snow, like ice on a river, like the breath of someone sleeping. You have traveled a long way tonight. Through frozen streets and broken ice and October guns and December quiet. Through grief and bread and courage and the small ordinary miracle of a door that opens every morning. All of that can rest now. There is nothing left to follow. No more streets to walk, no more seasons to turn. Just the dark, and the warmth, and your own breathing, slow and slow and slower still.
The snow is falling. The river is almost still.
You are safe.
You are warm.
You are held in the dark the way the city is held, gently, completely, with the knowledge that morning will come, that it always comes, and that there will be something warm waiting in it.
Sleep now.
Just sleep.
The story is finished.
The oven is banked.
The bread is rising. Sleep.
This concludes the story.
Sleep well. Good night.